In a small coastal town where the sea met the sky in shades of silver and blue, there stood an ancient lighthouse that had guided sailors home for over 200 years. The lighthouse was perched on a rocky cliff that jutted out into the ocean like a giant's finger pointing toward the horizon. Its white tower rose high above the crashing waves, and at night, its light swept across the dark waters in a steady rhythm that had become as familiar to the townspeople as their own heartbeats. The lighthouse keeper was an old man named Thomas Whitmore, who had tended the light for nearly 40 years. He lived alone in the small cottage attached to the base of the tower, with only his books, his telescope, and the endless song of the sea for company. Thomas was a quiet man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which wasn't often these days. He had inherited the position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him, creating a legacy that stretched back through generations of Whitmore men who had all shared the same calling: to keep the light burning so that no ship would be lost to the treacherous rocks that lurked beneath the waves. Every evening as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Thomas would climb the 173 spiral steps to the lamp room at the top of the tower. His knees ached with each step, a reminder that he was no longer the young man who had first taken on this responsibility, but he never complained. The ritual of lighting the lamp, checking the mechanisms, and watching the great lens begin its rotation was sacred to him, a meditation that connected him to his ancestors and to every sailor who depended on that beam of light to find their way home. On this particular evening in late autumn, the sky was painted in extraordinary colors, deep purples and burning oranges that seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. Thomas paused on the gallery that encircled the lamp room, gripping the iron railing as he looked out over the vast expanse of ocean. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the taste of salt and the promise of a storm. He could see dark clouds gathering on the distant horizon, moving toward the coast with deliberate menace. It would be a rough night, he thought, and he made a mental note to check that all the shutters were secure and that he had enough oil for the lamp in case the storm lasted longer than expected. As he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye, a small boat struggling against the rising waves far out to sea. Thomas hurried to fetch his telescope, his heart already beginning to race with concern. Through the lens, he could make out a fishing vessel, one of the local boats that he recognized, being tossed about like a toy in a bathtub. He knew the boat belonged to the Hendersons, a family of fishermen who had worked these waters for as long as anyone could remember. Young Michael Henderson, barely 20 years old, had taken over the family business after his father's death last winter, and Thomas worried that the boy's inexperience might have led him to stay out too long, trying to prove himself capable of filling his father's boots. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed his radio and called the Coast Guard, reporting the vessel in distress and its approximate location. The voice on the other end assured him that they would dispatch a rescue boat immediately, but Thomas knew that in weather like this, even the fastest response might not be fast enough. All he could do now was make sure his lighthouse beam was burning as brightly as possible, serving as a beacon to guide both the struggling fishermen and his rescuers through the darkness that was rapidly descending upon the sea. He climbed back up to the lamp room and made adjustments to the mechanism, ensuring that every component was functioning at peak efficiency. Then he returned to the gallery with his telescope, watching and waiting, his weathered hands gripping the cold metal railing as the wind howled around him. The storm arrived with startling ferocity, rain lashing against the lighthouse in horizontal sheets, and waves crashing against the rocks below with such force that Thomas could feel the vibrations through the stone foundation. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white forks, followed by thunder that rolled across the heavens like the drums of war. Through it all, the lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, cutting through the chaos with unwavering persistence. Thomas remained at his post, his eyes straining through the telescope despite the rain that kept obscuring his vision. Minutes stretched into hours, each one an eternity of uncertainty and fear. Then, just when he was beginning to lose hope, he saw the lights of the Coast Guard cutter appearing through the storm, its powerful searchlights sweeping across the churning waters. He watched as the rescue boat approached the fishing vessel, saw the delicate operation of bringing the two boats alongside each other in such violent seas, and finally witnessed the moment when Michael Henderson was pulled to safety. Relief flooded through Thomas with such intensity that his legs nearly gave out beneath him, and he had to sit down on the cold metal floor of the gallery, his back against the lighthouse wall, as the adrenaline that had been sustaining him suddenly drained away. When the immediate crisis had passed and both boats were safely heading back to harbor, Thomas finally descended from the tower, his body exhausted but his spirit strangely energized. He made himself a cup of strong tea and sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the storm continue its assault on the coastline. This was not the first rescue his lighthouse had facilitated, nor would it be the last, but each one reminded him of why this work mattered, why the tradition his family had maintained for generations was more than just a job or an obligation, but a genuine calling. As he sipped his tea and listened to the wind rattling the windows, Thomas found his thoughts drifting back through the years to his own youth, to the dreams he had once harbored of leaving this isolated place and seeking adventure in the wider world. He remembered being a young man full of restless energy, chafing against the expectation that he would follow in his father's footsteps and spend his life in this solitary tower. He had wanted to see distant cities, to travel to exotic lands, to experience everything that life beyond this small coastal town had to offer. But then his father had fallen ill, and Thomas had come home to help with the lighthouse duties while his father recovered. Weeks had turned into months, and during that time, something had changed within him. He had begun to understand the quiet dignity of this work, the profound satisfaction that came from knowing that his vigilance might mean the difference between life and death for those who ventured out onto the unpredictable sea. When his father finally passed away 5 years later, Thomas had taken on the role of lighthouse keeper not out of obligation, but out of a genuine love for the work and a deep connection to the place that had shaped him. Now, sitting in his cottage as the storm raged outside, Thomas reflected on the choices he had made and found that he had no regrets. His life had not been filled with the exotic adventures he had once imagined, but it had been filled with purpose, and that, he had learned, was worth more than any amount of superficial excitement. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night and left behind a world that seemed washed clean and renewed. Thomas emerged from his cottage to find the rocks glistening with moisture and the sea sparkling under the morning sun as if nothing violent had occurred just hours before. He walked down the path that led to the small harbor where the fishing boats were moored, wanting to check on Michael Henderson and make sure the young man was unharmed. He found Michael on the dock, working on his boat alongside several other fishermen who had come to help assess the damage. The young man's face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night, but he was alive and apparently unhurt. When Michael saw Thomas approaching, he immediately set down his tools and walked over to meet him. The gratitude in the young man's eyes was so intense that Thomas felt almost embarrassed by it. Michael gripped his hand firmly and thanked him repeatedly, his voice thick with emotion, explaining how he had been following the lighthouse beam through the worst of the storm, how that steady light had given him hope when he thought all was lost, how it had led the Coast Guard straight to him. Thomas brushed off the thanks with characteristic modesty, insisting that he had only done what any lighthouse keeper would do, what was expected of someone in his position. But inside, he felt a warm glow of satisfaction, knowing that his vigil had not been in vain. Over the following days, word of the rescue spread through the town, and Thomas found himself receiving visits from grateful townspeople who wanted to thank him personally. Among the visitors was a young woman named Sarah Chun, a journalist who had recently moved to town to work for the local newspaper. She was interested in writing a feature story about the lighthouse and its keeper, about the long tradition of the Whitmore family and their dedication to protecting sailors from the dangerous coast. Thomas was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being the subject of such attention, but Sarah was persistent and charming, and eventually he agreed to let her interview him. Sarah began visiting the lighthouse regularly, spending hours talking with Thomas about his life, his work, and his thoughts on everything from the changing technology that was making traditional lighthouses obsolete to his memories of growing up in the lighthouse keeper's cottage with his parents and siblings. Thomas found himself enjoying these conversations more than he had expected. Sarah was intelligent and curious, with a genuine interest in the stories he had to tell, and her questions made him think about aspects of his life that he had long taken for granted. Through their discussions, Thomas began to see his own experiences with fresh eyes, recognizing the uniqueness of the life he had led and the valuable perspective he had gained from his years of solitary observation and contemplation. One afternoon, as they sat in the lamp room at the top of the tower, Sarah asked him about loneliness, whether he ever felt isolated living by himself in such a remote location. Thomas considered the question carefully before answering, explaining that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. Solitude, he said, was a choice, a deliberate withdrawal from the noise and distraction of society in order to achieve a kind of clarity and peace that was impossible in the midst of crowds and constant stimulation. Loneliness, on the other hand, was an absence, a feeling of disconnection and emptiness that came from lacking meaningful human contact. He admitted that there had been times, especially in his younger years and after the death of his wife Margaret 15 years ago, when loneliness had been a heavy burden. But over time, he had learned to transform that loneliness into solitude, to find companionship in the natural world around him, in the books he read, and in the sense of connection he felt with all the sailors he was helping through his work. Sarah listened intently, scribbling notes in her reporter's pad, and Thomas could see that his words had affected her deeply. She confessed that she had moved to this small town partly to escape the overwhelming pace of city life, that she had been feeling lost and disconnected despite being surrounded by millions of people, and that talking with him had helped her understand what she was really searching for. The article Sarah eventually wrote was beautiful, a thoughtful meditation on tradition, dedication, and the quiet heroism of everyday life. She captured not just the facts of Thomas's work, but the spirit behind it, the philosophy that had sustained him through decades of service. When the article was published, it attracted attention far beyond the local readership. People from all over the region began visiting the lighthouse, wanting to see for themselves the place and the man that Sarah had written about so eloquently. The town council, recognizing an opportunity to boost tourism, proposed turning the lighthouse into a historical site once Thomas retired, with regular tours and educational programs. Thomas had mixed feelings about this proposal. On one hand, he was pleased that the lighthouse would be preserved and that future generations would learn about its history and importance. On the other hand, the idea of his private sanctuary becoming a public attraction felt somewhat uncomfortable, as if something sacred was being commodified and packaged for consumption. But he understood that nothing remained unchanged forever, that each generation had to find its own way of honoring the past while moving forward into the future. As months passed and turned into a year, Thomas and Sarah developed a deep friendship that surprised them both. Despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, they discovered a remarkable compatibility of temperament and interest. Sarah began helping Thomas with various tasks around the lighthouse, learning how to operate the equipment and maintain the facility. Thomas, in turn, shared with her all the knowledge he had accumulated over his long career, teaching her not just the technical aspects of lighthouse keeping, but also the subtle art of reading the sea and the sky, of anticipating changes in weather and understanding the rhythms of the coastal environment. There was something almost magical about watching the seasons change from the vantage point of the lighthouse tower, Sarah thought. Each season brought its own character and challenges. Winter was harsh and dramatic, with powerful storms that tested the resilience of both the structure and its keeper. Spring arrived with flocks of migrating birds that would rest on the gallery railing, filling the air with their songs. Summer brought warm breezes and calm seas, along with tourists and boaters who sometimes needed assistance or information. Autumn was perhaps the most beautiful season, with its spectacular sunsets and the melancholy sense of time passing that seemed to permeate everything. Through all these seasons, Thomas and Sarah maintained their companionship, finding in each other a kind of understanding that neither had experienced with anyone else. For Thomas, Sarah represented a link to the wider world beyond his lighthouse, a reminder that life continued with all its complexity and possibility. For Sarah, Thomas embodied a kind of wisdom and contentment that she had been seeking without knowing it, a demonstration that a meaningful life could be built on seemingly simple foundations of purpose and dedication. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the gallery watching the sun set over the ocean, Sarah surprised Thomas by telling him that she had been offered a job at a major newspaper in the city, a significant career opportunity that would require her to leave the small coastal town. Thomas felt a pang of sadness at the news, but he smiled and congratulated her warmly, knowing that he could not and should not try to keep her from pursuing her ambitions. Sarah seemed troubled, though, and after a long silence, she confessed that she was uncertain about whether to accept the offer. She had found something precious in this quiet place, she said, something that she feared she would lose if she returned to the frenetic pace of city life. Thomas listened carefully to her concerns, then offered his perspective. He reminded her of their conversation about solitude and loneliness, about the importance of understanding what truly mattered to oneself rather than following the expectations of others. He told her that the choice was hers alone to make, but that whatever she decided, she should make sure it was based on what would bring her genuine fulfillment rather than what would look impressive to others or what might be considered the conventional measure of success. He also assured her that the peace and clarity she had found here was not dependent on physical location, but on a state of mind that she could carry with her wherever she went. Sarah thanked him for his wisdom and promised to think carefully about her decision. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself hoping that she would stay, while simultaneously wanting her to follow whatever path would make her happiest. It was a curious emotional contradiction that reminded him of how his own parents must have felt when he had talked about leaving to seek adventure in his youth. The answer came 2 weeks later when Sarah appeared at the Lighthouse with a bottle of champagne and a broad smile on her face. She had decided to turn down the job offer, she announced, and instead was going to start her own independent journalism project, focusing on stories from small communities and the people who kept traditions alive in an increasingly homogenized world. She would be able to base herself in the coastal town while traveling to other locations for research and interviews. It was a compromise that allowed her to pursue her professional ambitions while maintaining the lifestyle and connections that had come to mean so much to her. Thomas was delighted by this news, and they spent the evening celebrating and making plans for how Sarah could document not just the Lighthouse, but similar institutions and individuals throughout the region. As they talked, Thomas felt a sense of excitement and renewal that he had not experienced in years. Sarah's presence and enthusiasm had reawakened something in him, a reminder that even in the later stages of life, there were still new possibilities and adventures to be found. The project Sarah embarked upon was ambitious and consuming. She spent the next several months traveling to different coastal communities, interviewing lighthouse keepers, harbor masters, life-saving station personnel, and others whose work involved protecting and serving those who ventured onto the sea. She documented their stories with both words and photographs, creating a rich tapestry of human experience that celebrated dedication, courage, and the often overlooked contributions of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. Thomas helped however he could, offering contacts and suggestions, reviewing her drafts, and providing the kind of contextual knowledge that came from his decades of experience. Through Sarah's eyes, Thomas began to see his own work and life in a new light. Her enthusiasm and appreciation helped him recognize that what he had sometimes taken for granted as merely the performance of duty was actually part of a larger narrative about human resilience and community. The lighthouse was not just a navigation aid, but a symbol of humanity's determination to make the dangerous world a little safer, to look out for one another even at personal cost. It represented the best of what people could be when they committed themselves to something larger than their own immediate interests. As Sarah's work progressed, she began to receive recognition from various journalism organizations and community groups. Her articles were being published in regional magazines and occasionally picked up by national publications. She was invited to give talks and presentations about her project, and she always made sure to mention Thomas and his lighthouse as the inspiration for her work. Thomas accompanied her to a few of these events, somewhat uncomfortable with the attention, but proud of what Sarah had accomplished and grateful for the opportunity to see her success firsthand. At one particularly memorable event, a symposium on maritime heritage held at a university several hours away from their town, Sarah gave a keynote presentation that featured Thomas's story prominently. She spoke about how meeting him had changed her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life, how his example had shown her that significance was not measured by fame or wealth, but by the positive impact one had on others and the integrity with which one pursued one's calling. She showed photographs of the lighthouse at different times of day and in various weather conditions, each image accompanied by stories of rescues and near disasters, of routine maintenance and exceptional emergencies, of the quiet daily rhythms that defined a lighthouse keeper's existence. When the presentation ended, the audience gave Sarah a standing ovation, and many people approached her afterward to ask questions and share their own stories of lighthouses and the people who tended them. Thomas stood to the side, watching with a mixture of pride and humility, still somewhat amazed that his ordinary life had become the subject of such interest and admiration. That evening, as they drove back toward home through the darkness, Sarah reached over and took Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. She thanked him for believing in her project and for sharing his life so openly with her. Thomas squeezed back, not trusting himself to speak past the emotion that had risen in his throat. He realized that their friendship had become one of the most important relationships of his life, perhaps second only to his marriage to Margaret all those years ago. The thought was startling, but also deeply comforting, a reminder that the human heart never truly ages and that connection and love can blossom at any stage of life. As summer approached, Thomas began to notice changes in his health. He tired more easily than before, and sometimes he felt short of breath when climbing the lighthouse stairs. He mentioned these symptoms to his doctor during a routine checkup, and the doctor ordered a series of tests. The results were not what Thomas had hoped to hear. His heart was showing signs of significant weakness, a consequence of both age and the physical demands he had placed on it over the years. The doctor recommended that he consider retiring from his position as lighthouse keeper, that he should avoid the kind of strenuous activity that climbing stairs multiple times a day represented. Thomas listened to this advice with a heavy heart, knowing that the doctor was right, but feeling reluctant to give up the work that had defined his life for so long. He asked for time to think about it, to make arrangements, and to prepare himself mentally for such a major transition. The doctor agreed, but warned him not to take too long, emphasizing that his health could deteriorate quickly if he did not reduce his physical stress. That evening, Thomas sat in his favorite chair and looked around the cottage that had been his home for so many decades. Every object in the room held memories, photographs on the walls of his parents and grandparents, of Margaret on their wedding day, of storms and sunsets and ships that had passed in the night. The brass telescope that had belonged to his grandfather stood by the window, still functional and frequently used. Books lined the shelves, many of them read multiple times, their pages filled with marginalia and underlined passages that documented his intellectual journey through the years. The cottage and the lighthouse were not just buildings, but extensions of himself, physical manifestations of his identity and purpose. The thought of leaving them felt like a kind of death, an ending that he was not ready to face. But he also recognized that he had been fortunate to serve for as long as he had, that 40 years of lighthouse keeping was a significant achievement, and that perhaps it was time to pass the responsibility to someone younger and stronger. The question was whether such a person existed in the modern world, whether the tradition of dedicated lighthouse keepers would continue, or whether automation and technology would make such individuals obsolete. Sarah noticed that something was troubling Thomas, and she gently pressed him until he shared the news about his health and the doctor's recommendation. Her immediate response was concern for his well-being, insisting that he follow the doctor's advice and take care of himself. But she also understood what this decision meant to him, how difficult it would be to leave behind the work that had given his life meaning and structure. They talked long into the night about possibilities and alternatives, about what retirement might look like and what Thomas might do with his time if he was no longer keeping the lighthouse. Sarah suggested that he could write his memoirs, documenting his experiences and the history of the lighthouse for future generations. She offered to help him with the project, to serve as his editor and researcher. Thomas was intrigued by this idea, recognizing that it would give him a new purpose and a way to preserve the stories and knowledge he had accumulated. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began the process of preparing for retirement. He contacted the maritime authority that oversaw the lighthouse operations and informed them of his decision. They were understanding but also concerned, as finding a replacement lighthouse keeper was not easy in an era when most coastal navigation had been automated. However, there was still value in having a human presence at the facility, someone who could perform maintenance, respond to emergencies, and maintain the historic building. They told Thomas they would begin searching for a suitable candidate and that he could take his time with the transition, that there was no immediate rush as long as he felt capable of continuing his duties for the time being. This news gave Thomas some relief, allowing him to adjust to the idea of retirement gradually rather than facing an abrupt end to his career. During this transition period, Thomas began working with Sarah on his memoirs. They established a routine where she would visit several times a week with her recording equipment, and Thomas would tell stories from his years as lighthouse keeper while Sarah captured everything on tape. Later, she would transcribe the recordings and work with Thomas to shape them into coherent narratives. The process was both therapeutic and illuminating for Thomas. As he recounted events from decades past, he found connections and patterns that he had not recognized before, seeing his life not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a coherent story with themes and meanings that emerged from the telling. He talked about his childhood growing up in the lighthouse, about the games he and his siblings had played on the rocks and beaches, about learning navigation and astronomy from his father, about the terrible winter storm that had nearly destroyed the lighthouse when he was 10 years old. He remembered his mother's strength and grace, how she had created a warm and loving home in what could have been a lonely and harsh environment. He spoke about his years away from the lighthouse, his brief attempt at a different life, the restlessness that had driven him away, and the deeper calling that had brought him back. He shared memories of Margaret, the town schoolteacher he had fallen in love with and married, describing their courtship and their life together in vivid detail. Margaret had brought joy and companionship to the lighthouse, transforming it from a place of solitary duty into a true home. She had understood and supported his work, even though it meant accepting a degree of isolation and unpredictability that many women would have found difficult. Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion as he remembered her final years, her long battle with cancer, and the grief that had nearly consumed him after her death. He had survived that dark period by throwing himself into his work, by finding solace in the routine and purpose that lighthouse keeping provided. Sarah listened to all of this with complete attention, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting Thomas speak. She could see how important this process was for him, how telling these stories was helping him come to terms with his impending retirement and with the long arc of his life. The manuscript grew steadily, page by page, story by story, until it began to take on the shape of a genuine book. Sarah showed some of the early chapters to a publisher friend who worked for a regional press, and the friend expressed strong interest in potentially publishing the complete work. This possibility excited both Thomas and Sarah, giving them additional motivation to continue the project with care and dedication. As autumn arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of the dramatic rescue that had first brought Thomas and Sarah together. The Maritime Authority informed Thomas that they had found a potential replacement keeper. The candidate was a young woman named Jessica Morales, recently discharged from the Coast Guard and looking for work that would allow her to use her maritime skills while staying in the region where she had grown up. The authorities arranged for Jessica to visit the lighthouse and meet Thomas to see if she would be a good fit for the position. When Jessica arrived, Thomas was immediately impressed by her competence and enthusiasm. She had a quick mind and a genuine respect for the traditions of lighthouse keeping, despite her familiarity with modern navigation technology. She asked intelligent questions about the equipment and the routines, about the history of the lighthouse and the challenges of the position. Thomas found himself warming to her quickly, seeing in her some of the same qualities that had made him suitable for the work all those years ago. Over the next several weeks, Thomas began training Jessica, teaching her everything she would need to know to take over the position. They climbed the lighthouse stairs together, Thomas moving more slowly now, but still determined to pass on his knowledge completely and accurately. He showed her how to maintain the lamp, how to read the weather signs, how to use all the communication equipment, and how to keep the logbooks that documented every significant event. He also shared the less tangible aspects of the work, the philosophy and attitude that he believed were essential to being a good lighthouse keeper. He talked about the importance of vigilance and consistency, about taking pride in one's work even when no one was watching, about the sacred trust that came with being responsible for the safety of others. Jessica absorbed all of this like a sponge, taking detailed notes and asking for clarification whenever something was unclear. Thomas could see that she had the potential to become an excellent lighthouse keeper, perhaps even better than he had been thanks to her younger eyes, stronger body, and more current technical knowledge. The thought that the lighthouse would be in good hands after his departure gave him great comfort, easing some of the sadness that accompanied the idea of leaving. On his last day as official lighthouse keeper, a ceremony was held in the town square to honor Thomas's 40 years of service. The mayor gave a speech praising his dedication and reliability, noting that not a single night in 4 decades had passed without the lighthouse beams sweeping across the waters. Local fishermen testified to the comfort and security they had always felt knowing that Thomas was watching over them from his tower. Children from the local school sang a song they had learned about lighthouses and the sea. Sarah read excerpts from Thomas's memoirs, bringing many in the audience to tears with her eloquent reading of his words. Finally, Thomas himself spoke, his voice quiet but steady, thanking everyone for their support over the years and expressing his confidence that Jessica would carry on the tradition with honor. He ended by saying that while he was retiring from the official position, he would never stop being a lighthouse keeper in his heart, that he would continue to watch the sea and worry about the ships and feel that connection to something larger than himself. When the ceremony ended, there was not a dry eye in the crowd, and people lined up to shake Thomas's hand and wish him well in his retirement. That evening, for the first time in 40 years, Thomas did not climb the lighthouse stairs to light the lamp. Instead, he stood in his cottage and watched through the window as Jessica performed the ritual, seeing the beam begin its rotation right on schedule. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both loss and relief, with sadness and satisfaction. He had done his duty and done it well, and now it was time to let go and trust the next generation to carry forward what he and his ancestors had built. Retirement proved to be more challenging than Thomas had anticipated. Without the structure and purpose that lighthouse keeping had provided, he felt somewhat adrift at first, unsure of how to fill his days. But Sarah was there to support him through the transition, visiting regularly and keeping him engaged with the memoir project. They worked diligently to complete the manuscript, refining and polishing each chapter until they were both satisfied with the result. The publisher accepted the book enthusiastically, and 9 months after Thomas's retirement, The Lighthouse Keeper's Log, 40 Years of Watching the Sea, was published to considerable acclaim. The book resonated with readers who were hungry for stories of dedication and meaning in an increasingly fragmented and fast-paced world. Reviews praised Thomas's honest and unassuming narrative voice, his ability to find profound significance in everyday experiences, and his insights into the relationship between humans and the natural world. The book sold well beyond anyone's expectations, and Thomas found himself somewhat bewildered by his newfound status as a minor celebrity. He was invited to give talks and interviews, to appear at book festivals and literary events. Sarah helped him navigate this new world, serving as his informal manager and making sure he was not overwhelmed by the attention. Together, they traveled to various locations where Thomas shared his stories and his philosophy with audiences who listened with rapt attention. He discovered that he had a gift for public speaking, that his quiet authenticity and genuine wisdom connected with people in powerful ways. Many listeners told him that his book and his talks had inspired them to think differently about their own lives, to consider whether they were living with purpose and integrity or simply going through the motions. These conversations gave Thomas a new sense of purpose, replacing the specific duty of keeping the lighthouse with a broader mission of encouraging others to find meaning in their own work and relationships. As time passed, Thomas and Sarah's relationship continued to deepen and evolve. What had begun as a friendship between a lonely old man and a curious young journalist had become something richer and more complex, a bond that transcended age and circumstance. They spent most of their time together, whether working on new writing projects, attending events, or simply enjoying quiet evenings watching the sea. People in town began to comment on their relationship, some with approval and others with curiosity, wondering whether there was a romantic dimension to their connection. Thomas and Sarah never felt the need to define or explain what they meant to each other, content simply to enjoy the companionship and understanding they had found. In the second year of his retirement, Thomas's health stabilized somewhat. The reduced physical demands of his new lifestyle, combined with proper medical care and a more relaxed pace, seemed to agree with him. His doctor was pleased with his progress and encouraged him to continue taking care of himself. Thomas felt grateful for this reprieve, recognizing that he had been given additional time to enjoy life and pursue new interests. He began taking up hobbies he had never had time for during his lighthouse keeping days, including painting seascapes and learning to play the harmonica. He was not particularly skilled at either activity, but he found joy in the process of creation and learning, in developing new capacities even at his advanced age. Jessica proved to be an exceptional lighthouse keeper, maintaining the tradition while also bringing her own innovations and improvements to the role. She established an outreach program where school groups could visit the lighthouse to learn about maritime history and navigation. She created a website documenting the lighthouse's history and current operations. She also began participating in regional lighthouse keeper associations, networking with others who shared her profession and passion. Thomas was proud of what she had accomplished, feeling vindicated in his assessment that she was the right person to succeed him. He visited the lighthouse regularly, always welcomed by Jessica, who valued his wisdom and experience. These visits satisfied Thomas's need to maintain connection with the place that had been so central to his life, while also allowing him to see it with fresh eyes as a visitor rather than the keeper. One winter evening, nearly 3 years after his retirement, Thomas and Sarah were sitting in the cottage watching snow fall gently outside the windows, an unusual sight in their usually temperate coastal climate. The lighthouse beams swept through the darkness and the snow, creating patterns of light that were mesmerizingly beautiful. They had been talking about Thomas's childhood, about his memories of other snowy winters long ago, when Sarah suddenly asked him whether he had any regrets about his life. Thomas thought carefully before answering, as was his habit with important questions. He said that while there were certainly things he might have done differently if he had known then what he knew now, he did not experience those alternative possibilities as regrets exactly. Every choice he had made, every path he had followed, had been the right one for the person he was at that time with the knowledge and understanding he possessed. His life had not been perfect, but it had been authentic, and that authenticity was what gave it value and meaning. He told Sarah that if he could go back and change things, he would not, because any change might have prevented him from becoming the person he was now, and he had worked too hard becoming that person to wish him away. Sarah understood what he meant, recognizing in his words the same wisdom that had first attracted her to him, and that continued to guide her own efforts to live with intentionality and purpose. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the snow and the light, each lost in their own thoughts but together in their companionship. In the spring of that year, Thomas received word that his book had won a regional literary award for nonfiction. The news came as a surprise, though perhaps it should not have given the book success and positive reception. Sarah was ecstatic, insisting that they must attend the awards ceremony, even though Thomas felt somewhat ambivalent about such formal recognition. At her urging, he agreed to go, and they made the trip to the state capital where the ceremony was being held. The event was elegant and well-attended, with authors, publishers, and literary enthusiasts filling a grand ballroom. Thomas felt out of place in his uncomfortable suit and tie, but Sarah was there beside him, looking beautiful in a dress she had bought specially for the occasion, and her presence gave him courage. When his name was called and he walked to the stage to accept the award, he was met with enthusiastic applause. He stood at the podium, holding the heavy crystal trophy, and looked out at the sea of faces before him. He spoke briefly, thanking Sarah for her help and encouragement, thanking the publisher for believing in his story, and thanking all the readers who had taken the time to engage with his words. But mostly he talked about the importance of paying attention to one's life, of recognizing that every moment contains the possibility of meaning if we approach it with awareness and intention. He said that he hoped his book might inspire others to find the lighthouse in their own lives, whatever form that took, to identify their own calling and pursue it with dedication regardless of whether it brought fame or fortune. The audience responded with another round of applause, and Thomas left the stage feeling that he had said what needed to be said. The years that followed were peaceful and fulfilling for Thomas. He continued to write, producing a second book that explored the natural history of the coastal region and his observations of how the ecosystem had changed over his decades of watching. He remained active in the community, serving as a mentor to young people and an advocate for historic preservation. His relationship with Sarah continued to be the emotional center of his life, providing him with companionship intellectual stimulation, and a sense of being truly known and appreciated by another person. They never married or even discussed marriage, both seeming to understand instinctively that the legal and social formalities would add nothing to what they already shared. What they had was beyond definition or categorization, a meeting of souls that transcended conventional relationships. Thomas often marveled at how unexpected his life's trajectory had been, how he could never have predicted in his youth that his greatest joys would come from such simple things. The daily rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of work well done, the comfort of deep friendship, and the pleasure of sharing his experiences through writing. He thought about all the young people he saw rushing about, frantically pursuing success and recognition, and he wished he could somehow convey to them that true contentment came not from achieving external goals, but from aligning one's actions with one's deepest values. But he also recognized that this was a lesson that could not be taught, only learned through experience, and that each person had to find their own path to understanding. On the morning of his 75th birthday, Thomas woke to find that Sarah had prepared a surprise celebration. She had invited many of his friends from town, including Jessica, who closed the Lighthouse Visitor Center for the afternoon, to attend, the mayor, several fishermen he had known for decades, and even some readers who had traveled considerable distances to meet the author whose words had touched them. The party was held in the community center overlooking the harbor, with decorations in blue and white that echoed the colors of the sea and the lighthouse. There was food and music and laughter, and Thomas found himself surrounded by warmth and affection that moved him deeply. When it came time to cut the birthday cake, Sarah stood beside him and made a short toast, speaking about how Thomas had changed her life and the lives of so many others through his example of living with purpose and integrity. She said that knowing him had been the greatest gift of her life, and that she hoped to continue learning from him for many years to come. Thomas embraced her, unable to speak past the emotion that flooded through him, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Later that evening, after all the guests had departed and the decorations had been taken down, Thomas and Sarah walked together down to the rocky beach below the lighthouse. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of crimson and gold, and the lighthouse beam was just beginning its nightly rotation. They sat on a large, smooth rock that Thomas had sat on countless times over the years, and they watched as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Thomas pointed out constellations that his father had taught him to identify when he was a boy, telling Sarah the stories and legends associated with each pattern of stars. She listened with the same attentive interest she had shown from the beginning of their friendship, asking questions and making observations that revealed her own growing knowledge of the night sky. As they sat there in the gathering darkness with the sound of the waves providing a rhythmic accompaniment to their conversation, Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude and completion. His life had been long and full, marked by both challenges and triumphs, losses and gains. He had known love and grief, solitude and companionship, routine and adventure. He had served his community faithfully and had been rewarded with respect and affection. He had found his voice as a writer and had been able to share his experiences and insights with others. Most importantly, he had lived authentically, making choices that reflected his true values rather than external expectations. If his life were to end tomorrow, he would have no complaints, no sense of things left undone or opportunities missed. He had done what he came to do, and he had done it well. Of course, life did not end the next day or even the next year. Thomas continued on, his health holding steady despite the inevitable deteriorations that came with advanced age. He walked with a cane now and moved more slowly than before, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit undimmed. He wrote a third book, this one a collection of essays on topics ranging from environmental stewardship to the meaning of home to reflections on mortality and legacy. This book was more philosophical than his previous works, drawing on not just his lighthouse keeping experience, but on his reading in literature, philosophy, and science. It showed a depth of thought and breadth of knowledge that surprised some readers who had assumed he was merely a simple man with a simple story to tell. The truth was that Thomas had never been simple, though he was certainly humble and unpretentious. His decades of solitude had given him countless hours to read, think, and develop a sophisticated understanding of human nature and the world. His third book cemented his reputation as not just a memoirist, but a genuine thinker whose insights deserved serious consideration. Academic scholars began writing papers analyzing his work, and he was invited to speak at universities and cultural institutions. All of this attention bemused Thomas somewhat, but he accepted it graciously, viewing it as an opportunity to spread ideas that he believed were important. Through all of this, Sarah remained his constant companion and collaborator. She had established herself as a respected journalist and author in her own right, though she always credited Thomas with inspiring and guiding her work. Together, they had become something of a fixture in the regional literary and cultural scene, known for their partnership and mutual support. People spoke of them with affection and admiration, seeing in their relationship a model of how humans could connect across differences of age and background to create something beautiful and meaningful. The lighthouse itself had become a popular tourist destination, thanks in part to the attention generated by Thomas's books and Jessica's outreach efforts. Thousands of visitors came each year to climb the tower, tour the keeper's cottage, which had been converted into a small museum, and learn about the history of the structure and the families who had maintained it. Thomas was pleased by this development, feeling that it ensured the lighthouse would be preserved and appreciated for future generations. He sometimes served as a volunteer docent, giving talks to groups of visitors about his experiences. These interactions energized him, providing opportunities to meet people from all over the world and to see his own story reflected in their responses and questions. One particularly memorable encounter occurred when a young man approached Thomas after one of his talks and told him that he had been working in finance, making a lot of money but feeling empty and purposeless when he had read Thomas's first book. The book had prompted him to completely reevaluate his priorities, and he had ultimately left his high-paying job to become a park ranger in a national forest. He said that he was now making a fraction of his former salary, but was happier than he had ever been, and he wanted to thank Thomas for helping him find the courage to change his life. Thomas was deeply moved by this testimony, recognizing that his words had had exactly the kind of impact he had hoped for. He told the young man that he should be proud of himself for having the strength to pursue authenticity over security, and that the world needed more people who were willing to serve something larger than their own material interests. As Thomas entered his late 70s, he began to think more seriously about his own mortality and what would happen after he was gone. He had no children of his own, and his siblings had all either passed away or moved far from the coastal town decades ago. The lighthouse and its traditions would continue through Jessica and whoever succeeded her, and his books would presumably remain in print for some time. But he wondered what else he might do to extend his influence and values beyond his own lifespan. After much thought and discussion with Sarah, he decided to establish a small foundation dedicated to supporting young people who wanted to pursue careers in maritime service, environmental conservation, or other fields that involve protecting and serving communities. He donated most of the proceeds from his books to seed the foundation, and Sarah helped him set up the administrative structures needed to make it functional. The foundation began awarding scholarships and grants to worthy candidates, and Thomas took great satisfaction in reading the applications and learning about the aspirations of young people who shared his values. One of the first scholarship recipients was a teenager from the local high school who wanted to study marine biology so she could help protect the ocean ecosystems that were threatened by climate change and pollution. Thomas met with her before she left for university, offering advice and encouragement, and he maintained correspondence with her throughout her studies. She eventually became a respected researcher whose work contributed to important conservation efforts, and she always credited Thomas's support and mentorship as crucial to her success. As winter approached in what would prove to be Thomas's 80th year, he began to feel unwell in ways that he recognized as serious. His heart, which had served him faithfully for 8 decades despite the stresses he had subjected it to, was finally beginning to fail in more significant ways. His doctor recommended hospitalization for treatment and monitoring, but Thomas declined, saying that he preferred to remain in his cottage by the sea for whatever time he had left. He was not afraid of death, having thought about it often over the years and having made his peace with the inevitability of his own ending. He only wanted to die in the place he loved, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds, with Sarah nearby. Sarah was devastated by the news of Thomas's declining condition, but respected his decision to remain at home. She moved into the cottage to care for him, taking leave from her work to devote herself entirely to making him comfortable. Jessica visited daily, often sitting with Thomas and listening to his stories or reading to him when he was too tired to talk. Other friends from town came by regularly, bringing food and flowers and their well wishes. The mayor declared a day of recognition in Thomas's honor, celebrating his contributions to the community over his long life. Local newspapers ran feature articles about him, and messages of gratitude and affection poured in from readers all over the world who had been touched by his books. Thomas received all of this attention with characteristic grace and humility, grateful for the kindness, but insisting that he had only done what anyone in his position would have done, that he deserved no special credit for simply living according to his principles. As his strength diminished and he spent more time in bed, Thomas found his thoughts turning increasingly to his past, to memories of his parents and siblings, of Margaret and the years they had shared, of all the storms he had weathered and ships he had guided safely home. He saw his life not as a collection of separate moments, but as a unified whole, a story with coherence and meaning. He had been a lighthouse keeper, yes, but more fundamentally, he had been a watcher and a guardian, someone who paid attention and cared about the well-being of others. That essential identity had expressed itself through his official duties, but also through his relationships, his writing, and his efforts to support and encourage others. He had tried to be a light in the darkness, not just through the literal beam of the lighthouse, but through his presence and his words, and he believed he had succeeded at least partially in that aspiration. On a cold December evening as a storm raged outside, Thomas asked Sarah to help him sit up in bed so he could look out the window toward the lighthouse. The beam was sweeping through the rain and wind, strong and steady, just as it had been every night for more than 200 years. Thomas watched it for a long time, finding comfort in its reliability and in the knowledge that it would continue long after he was gone. He turned to Sarah, who sat beside him holding his hand, and he thanked her for everything she had brought to his life, for seeing him so clearly and accepting him so completely, for giving his final years such richness and joy. Sarah tried to respond, but could not speak past her tears, so she simply squeezed his hand and rested her head gently on his shoulder. They stayed like that for hours, watching the lighthouse beam and listening to the storm, not needing words to communicate what they felt. As dawn approached and the storm began to subside, Thomas felt a strange sensation of lightness, as if the weight that had been pressing on his chest was lifting. His breathing, which had been labored and difficult for days, suddenly seemed to come more easily. He looked at Sarah and smiled, and she smiled back through her tears, understanding somehow that this was the moment. Thomas closed his eyes, took one final deep breath, and let it out slowly. His heart, which had beaten faithfully for 80 years and had sustained him through a lifetime of service and love, gave one last beat and was still. Sarah sat with him for a long time as the room gradually lightened with the coming day, holding his hand and saying goodbye. When she finally rose and called the doctor to report what had happened, she looked out the window and saw that the storm had cleared completely, leaving behind a sky of extraordinary clarity and beauty. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against the dawn, its beams still visible in the fading darkness, and she knew that Thomas would have appreciated the poetic rightness of dying just as the night gave way to day, just as the lighthouse completed its nightly vigil and prepared to rest through another rotation of the sun. The funeral was held on a crisp winter afternoon with hundreds of people in attendance, far more than the small church could accommodate, so the service was held outdoors near the lighthouse itself. People spoke about Thomas's kindness, his dedication, his wisdom, and his impact on their lives. Jessica read from his first book, her voice breaking with emotion as she recounted his words about the sacred duty of keeping the light burning. Sarah delivered a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and beautiful, speaking about love and friendship, about the importance of living with intention, about the legacy that Thomas had left not just in his books and his foundation, but in the countless lives he had touched through his example. She ended by looking up at the lighthouse tower and saying that while Thomas was gone, his light would continue to shine through all those he had inspired to live more purposefully and serve more generously. After the service, people processed past his casket, many leaving flowers or small tokens of appreciation, and then they gathered at the community center for a reception that turned into a celebration of his life. Stories were shared, laughter mixed with tears, and people who had never met before found common ground in their connection to Thomas and their gratitude for what he had meant to them. As evening approached and people began to leave, Sarah stood alone on the cliff near the lighthouse, looking out over the ocean that Thomas had watched for so many years. She could feel his presence somehow, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a remembered essence, a way of seeing and being in the world that he had taught her and that would remain with her for the rest of her life. The lighthouse beam began its rotation, cutting through the gathering darkness with mechanical precision, but also, Sarah thought, with a kind of purpose and consciousness that reflected the generations of keepers who had tended it. She understood then that Thomas had been right when he said that a lighthouse keeper never truly retired, that the calling lived in the heart regardless of formal duties. She would carry forward his commitment to watching and caring, to paying attention and serving others, to being a light in whatever darkness she encountered. This would be her way of honoring him and keeping his memory alive. In the months and years that followed, Sarah continued the work she and Thomas had begun together. She completed a biographical book about his life that became a bestseller and introduced his philosophy to an even wider audience. She took over management of the foundation he had established, expanding its scope and impact until it was helping dozens of young people each year pursue their callings and service professions. She maintained close contact with Jessica and helped develop new educational programs at the Lighthouse that taught visiting students not just about maritime history, but about the values of dedication, integrity, and service that Thomas had exemplified. She also continued her own writing and journalism, always trying to approach her work with the same authenticity and purpose that Thomas had demonstrated. The Lighthouse itself thrived as both a functional navigation aid and a cultural institution. New technologies were installed to make it more energy efficient while preserving its historic character. The museum in the keeper's cottage was expanded to include interactive exhibits and educational materials that made the history accessible to visitors of all ages. A small library was established featuring books by and about lighthouse keepers, including all of Thomas's works. School groups and tourists continued to visit in growing numbers, drawn by the romance of the lighthouse, but staying because of the deeper stories and lessons they discovered there. Thomas's legacy extended far beyond the physical structures and institutions he had been part of. His books continued to be read and discussed, often appearing on lists of recommended reading about meaningful work and purposeful living. His essays were anthologized in collections about environmental ethics, coastal life, and personal philosophy. Scholars studying the cultural history of lighthouses and maritime communities inevitably encountered his work and found it invaluable for the first-hand perspective it provided. Young people considering careers in service professions often cited his example as inspiration for their choices. Teachers used his books in their classes to prompt discussions about values, choices, and what it means to live a good life. 5 years after Thomas's death, on what would have been his 85th birthday, the town held a special ceremony dedicating a memorial in his honor. It was not a statue or monument, but rather a simple stone bench positioned on the cliff near the lighthouse, oriented to face the sea. A bronze plaque on the bench bore his name, his years of service, and a quote from his first book. A lighthouse keeper's duty is not just to maintain the light, but to embody it, to become through dedication and care a human beacon that guides others towards safety and home. Sarah attended the ceremony along with hundreds of others who had known Thomas or been influenced by his work. After the formal speeches and dedications were complete, she sat on the bench and looked out at the view Thomas had known so intimately. She could almost feel him beside her, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder, his quiet voice offering some observation about the weather or the sea or the eternal cycle of tides and seasons. She knew that he would have been embarrassed by all the fuss, would have insisted that the money spent on the memorial could have been better used for scholarships or lighthouse maintenance. But she also knew that he would have understood why people felt compelled to create some tangible way of expressing their gratitude and keeping his memory present in the physical landscape he had loved. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the lighthouse beam began its nightly rotation. Sarah sat on the bench watching until the stars emerged and the beam became the dominant light in the darkness. Other people had long since departed, but she remained, not ready to leave this place where she felt so close to the man who had changed her life so profoundly. Eventually, she rose and walked slowly back toward town, carrying with her the peace and clarity that always seemed to descend when she spent time near the lighthouse. Over the following years, Sarah herself became an elder stateswoman of sorts, respected for her work and sought after for advice by younger writers and activists. She never remarried or sought another relationship comparable to what she had shared with Thomas, finding completeness in her work, her friendships, and her memories. She continued to visit the lighthouse regularly, often sitting on Thomas's memorial bench to think and write. Some of her best work was produced during these contemplative sessions, as if Thomas's spirit or the place itself provided inspiration and focus. She watched as Jessica eventually retired from lighthouse keeping and was succeeded by another dedicated individual who had been inspired by Thomas's books. The lighthouse endured through storms and seasons, its beam never failing to illuminate the dangerous waters and guide ships safely past the rocks. The foundation Thomas established continued to grow, eventually expanding its mission to include environmental education and community service projects. Each year at the Scholarship Award ceremony, Sarah or another board member would read passages from Thomas's books and talk about his example, ensuring that new recipients understood that they were not just receiving financial assistance, but becoming part of a tradition of service and dedication. Many scholarship recipients stayed in touch with the foundation throughout their careers, often becoming donors or volunteers themselves once they were established, creating a virtuous cycle of support and inspiration. As Sarah entered her 60s and then her 70s, she began to think about her own legacy and mortality in ways similar to how Thomas had done in his final years. She had never had children, having devoted herself entirely to her work and her relationship with Thomas, but she did not feel any regret about this choice. Her life had been full and meaningful, rich with purpose and connection. She had made a difference in the world through her writing and her management of the foundation. She had helped preserve Thomas's memory and extend his influence far beyond what he could have accomplished alone. She had stayed true to the values he had taught her and had tried to be, in her own way, a light for others. When Sarah's own health began to fail and she knew her time was limited, she made arrangements to be buried next to Thomas in the cemetery overlooking the sea. She updated her will to leave her entire estate to the foundation and to ensure that the work she and Thomas had begun would continue. She wrote final letters to friends and colleagues, thanking them for their companionship and support over the years. And then, like Thomas before her, she chose to spend her final days in a cottage near the lighthouse, watching the beam rotate through the darkness and feeling the presence of the man she had loved and learned from. She died peacefully on a spring morning with the windows open and the sound of seabirds filling the air. Her funeral was even larger than Thomas's had been, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her work. At the service, someone read the eulogy she had delivered at Thomas's funeral years before, noting how the words she had spoken about him applied equally well to her own life. After her death, her biographical book about Thomas was reissued with a new epilogue written by a prominent literary critic who had known both of them, exploring how their partnership had produced a body of work and a set of institutions that would endure far into the future. The lighthouse continued its vigil, generation after generation of keepers maintaining the light and welcoming visitors who came to learn about the place and the people who had made it significant. Children who visited as part of school trips grew up and brought their own children, creating family traditions of pilgrimage to this special place. The books that Thomas and Sarah had written were passed from hand to hand, read and reread, their pages becoming worn but their messages remaining fresh and relevant. People continued to find in those pages guidance for how to live with purpose and integrity in a world that often seemed to value neither. And always, every night without fail, the lighthouse beams swept across the dark waters, a testament to human determination to bring light into darkness, to help one another navigate dangerous passages, to maintain hope and vigilance even when no immediate crisis demands attention. The light was more than just photons bouncing off a reflector and traveling through space. It was a symbol of every act of care and dedication that humans performed for one another, every choice to serve rather than to be served, every commitment to something larger than individual self-interest. In this way, Thomas and Sarah and all the other lighthouse keepers who had lived and worked in that tower achieved a kind of immortality, their lives becoming part of a story larger than themselves, a story about the best possibilities of human nature and the enduring power of purpose-driven lives. Long after their physical bodies had returned to the earth, their influence continued to ripple outward, touching people they had never met, inspiring actions they would never witness, contributing to a world slightly better than it would have been without their presence. This was the true legacy of the lighthouse keeper, not fame or wealth or monuments, but the quiet, persistent impact of a life lived in service of others, a light that continued to shine long after the keeper himself had moved beyond the need for light, guiding new generations home through whatever storms they encountered on their journeys across the dark and dangerous, but ultimately navigable seas of existence.